And let me quote Numbers 14:17-20 as it applies to the issue of the third and fourth generation. Quote, "But now I pray, let the power of the Lord be great, just as thou hast declared. The Lord is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations." Having quoted that, now here's what Moses prays. "Pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of thy loving kindness, just as thou also hast forgiven this people from Egypt even till now." So the Lord said, "I have pardoned them according to your word." And so when Moses quoted this third and fourth generation thing, then he pleaded to God for pardon because he saw that as a promise of mercy.
It's interesting with that group of people, the group that we're speaking of here, that created the transgression. What happened to them?
Again, back to what the Jewish scholars were pointing out. They think that perhaps what was going on was some of these people who heard about the third and fourth generation had the idea that I can sin and I'll get by with it, but my kids will be punished. This is not true, and this was clearly taught against in the Old Testament because it says there that the one that sinned, God would punish him to his face. Means to himself, not to his children. And it's interesting also that in the wilderness, what did really happen? The parents became idolaters. The parents broke covenant. The parents died in the wilderness. And who went into the promised land?
The children.
The children. In that case, he punished the parents, but blessed the children. And he let that whole generation die off and said, I'll fulfill my promise to these children because you have broken covenant by going after idols. So even in the exact context where these third and fourth generation passages are cited, we see that God is showing mercy, and never is he punishing the innocent.
Well, the concept of his showing mercy and the fact that he is known to be a God who shows mercy is probably best exemplified in Jonah's attitude about going out when he was sent, isn't it?
As a matter of fact, yes, because Jonah quoted Exodus 34, all right? If you know the story of Jonah, he was called to go preach to the Ninevites. The Ninevites were mortal enemies of the Jews. The Ninevites were the headquarters of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were known throughout the ancient world as being horrible and brutal and bloodthirsty. They tortured their victims. They did not allow the dead to be properly buried in order to terrorize the people that they were conquering. When they killed the enemy soldiers, they would put stakes out around the city with points on the end and hang the dead bodies of the soldiers all around the city so that in horror the women and children would see their husbands and fathers hanging on stakes dead. This was the Assyrians, and they'd done this sort of thing to the Jews. So knowing that, Jonah gets a call from God to go preach to them, and he doesn't want to do it. Why? Because Jonah knows that God's merciful, and what caused him to know that? Well, let me quote Jonah 4:1-2, after God had forgiven the Assyrians. Quote, "But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, Please, Lord, was not this what I said while I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish, for I knew that thou art a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity." Now, that was a citation from Exodus 34. But let me quote Exodus 34 in its entirety, and you'll see how this bears on the discussion of the third and fourth generation. Exodus 34:6-7. "Then the Lord passed by in front of him," Moses, "and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgressions, and sin." The part Jonah quoted, but listen on. "Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the grandchildren of the third and fourth generation."
Well, the question then is, was Jonah right?
Yes. Jonah knew this. Now think about this. Those Assyrians had been bloodthirsty, brutal killers for generations. And that group that was alive when Jonah ended up on their shore by a miraculous intervention were all the sons and grandsons of brutal murderers. And they were guilty of the same themselves. And Jonah said, I knew this would happen. What did Jonah know? Jonah knew that if God wanted to judge the Assyrians and destroy them, he would just leave them. They don't need a preacher to be judged and destroyed because they're already wicked and sinful and bound for hell. Jonah knew that if God was sending him, it was only for one reason, because he planned on saving them. And that's what he said in Jonah 4. I knew this would happen, that's why I didn't want to go. God, you're so merciful. I don't like that.
I can't trust you. You're going to be merciful.
I knew you were going to show these guys mercy. They didn't deserve mercy, but they received it because they listened to the preacher and they repented, and God showed them mercy. So therefore, that's more evidence that this third and fourth generation is given in the context of God's greater mercy, and it's a limitation on his judgment. It's a limitation on his wrath, showing that his mercy always goes further than his wrath. And there's evidence for that in another passage in the Old Testament, and that's in Deuteronomy chapter 7.
Let's go with that, because that will get us closer to explaining those who hate him. Correct?
Okay, well, here's what it says. Deuteronomy 7, 9, and 10. Quote, Know therefore that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God who keeps his covenant and his loving kindness to 1,000th generation with those who love him and keep his commandments, but repays those who hate him to their faces. Now, in this case, notice the thousands here, it's called 1,000th generation.
Correct.
The same term, thousand, is used in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. So here, the contrast is between iniquity visited to the third and fourth generation, loving kindness to 1,000.
Let's touch that hate him again. You bring it up in this particular context. Hate him meaning what?
To break covenant. In other words, it's like a marriage. I think we may have explained this in some other broadcast, but if a person marries, and this is his wife, and one day he comes home and he says, I don't care about you at all. I'm totally ambivalent. As far as I'm concerned, you're no different than somebody at work or somebody down the block or any person that might be alive on the earth. I don't hate you. I just think you don't mean much to me. In the context of a covenant, that's hatred. You are going to love and cherish this wife as long as you live.
So there's no neutrality.
You can't be neutral when you have a covenant relationship. So you enter into a marriage, you're committed to love and cherish your wife for the rest of your life. And if you're just neutral, you're just ambivalent and apathetic, you don't think the marriage means anything to you, that's the same as breaking covenant, and it's hatred.
So from God's perspective, if we don't care about him, that's breaking it.
Right. If they enter into a covenant relationship with God in the Old Testament, and the main requirement of the covenant is in Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The command is to love God with your whole being. And so if you just don't care, and it doesn't mean anything to you, and it's not important to you, and you might have a relationship with God, and then you buy your statue of Baal and stick that in your house too, and say, well, it's all the same to me. That is to hate God. So to hate is to not honor the covenant.
All right, let's move on to the parents and sour grapes. Ezekiel 18:2 says, What do you mean by using this proverb concerning the land of Israel, saying, The fathers eat the sour grapes, but the children's teeth are set on edge? Interesting to me, it's a challenge. What do you mean by saying this proverb? And then he's basically saying we have a generational situation.
Okay, Ezekiel 18, first of all, the context. Ezekiel was a prophet about the time of the captivity. Objectively, the people taken captive had reason to think that, because it was their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents who had been idolaters, and the leaders of Israel had been idolaters, and the kings of Israel had been idolaters. And because of their breaking covenant, God sent the Chaldeans to take them captive and to destroy the temple. Who was taken captive? But a lot of the young people, like Daniel and his friends, who ended up living in Babylon, and so they were complaining, this isn't fair. We're being punished for our parents' sins.
Parents sinned, we're paying.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the prophet said, you're not going to use this proverb anymore.